All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to class. This is our first real content piece of information that we're going to get, and I wanted to start with the purpose of education. And so I'm going to ask you all to do me a favor. I want you to, even though you feel silly, even though this is on a film and some of you are going to cheat and keep your eyes open, shame on you, you're a horrible human being. What I want you to do is take advice and take a deep breath and close your eyes, and I want you to think for a moment. Visualize what it looks like to have education. What does education look like to you? Keep your eyes closed for a few minutes, and I'm going to give you a second just to think about it. Here's what I'm wondering. I think everybody thinks a little bit differently about education, but many of you probably have something like this in your head. You're sitting at a desk. You imagine yourself looking at a computer or writing in a notebook or reading a really excellent textbook that's just profound. Chapters 1 through 4, commercial, just so you know you have to do this. All right, so as you start to go through these books and you think about this as education, what is the purpose of it? Is it to gain information? Is it more than that? Is it less than that? What I'm going to suggest over the course of this term, one of the things that we're going to be examining is what the purpose of education is. What does it look like? How is it different than learning? How is it different than trying to understand the world around you? So this particular section is broken into 3 sections, 3 major groups, and you're going to use a lot of this information when you start to talk about your philosophy of practice. The first 3 assignments are going to be tied into what you think about the purpose of education, the role of a teacher, the role of you as a practitioner if you're not going into education, the role of the school. And it has 3 major ideas. It's political. You need to know that schools are a political institution, which is frustrating because that often brings up sort of thoughts of left and right, Democrat and Republican. That's not what I mean by political. I mean that the purpose of education is truly a political purpose. We have to think about what the goals are of education. Is this an opportunity for us to do a reproduction of society? I'll explain that, don't worry about it. Or is it an opportunity for us to start to talk about having upward mobility within our society, to have a place where we learn about civics? It's also economic. Schools are about the economy. There's economy that drives school, and school in itself drives the economy. Is the function of school to create a place to produce workers? Check out Sir Ken Robinson when you look at week 2 in Blackboard, because that's going to talk a little bit about what I'm talking about there. And then what we're going to do is I want you to think about the economy of it. Are we creating a place where we're producing workers? Or are we creating an economic situation where we're producing leaders and thinkers? You'll have to determine that on your own. And the last thing that we're going to cover, and probably one of the things that's the most controversial, is education is social. It's extraordinarily social. Not just social that people get to learn how to have social skills, but social in how do we build our school system so we think about what we teach in those hidden curriculums. What moralities and values do we teach within our school system? How do we handle things like sex education? And yes, we're going to talk about sex because why not? And how do we handle things like whether your politics, in politics I mean left or right, when those interfere with your students' politics or your students' parents' politics or the school district's politics? How do all of those things come together to build something that we call this great sort of educational institution? It's a lot of different things.
You know what time it is? Disco time!
So initially, my brainstorm with this was that I would go into a classroom. And in a classroom, I would show you kind of where you're at. But in view of COVID, we're actually not allowed in classrooms, which is ironic. Either way, so rather than doing any of that, I'm going to show you some of my favorite clips that I think of when I think about classrooms. Now, you need to remember, I am older than you, so some of these clips might seem unfamiliar, so I'll try to explain some of them. This is a famous classic from the 1980s called Ferris Bueller's Day Off. And I think it's quintessential way that some of us think about our educational classrooms. Ferris Bueller.
In 1930, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effects of the, anyone? The Great Depression, passed the, anyone? A tariff bill, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which, anyone raised or lowered? Raised tariffs in an effort to collect more revenue for the federal government.
It does make you wonder, doesn't it? This is what my schooling was like. So when I say that schooling wasn't always my thing, there's a reason. So I would encourage you all to watch Ferris Bueller's Day Off. It is a great film, and it's rather sad. That's only 30 seconds. That's 31 seconds into the film, and we go to 33, and it's still boring. It doesn't get better. The second film is also a classic, although most of you won't think of it as a classic because it's a classic that was born before your time. Sadly, I remember when these books came out. So this is a famous film called Harry Potter. Now, if you don't know anything about Harry Potter, what you should know is that Harry is a wizard. And because Harry is a wizard, he goes to a wizarding school. So sometimes when we imagine what schooling could be like, this is what we think about.
We made it. Can you imagine the look on McGonagall's face if we were late? That was bloody brilliant.
Oh, thank you for that assessment, Mr. Weasley. Perhaps it would be more useful if I were to transfigure Mr. Potter and yourself into a pocket watch. That way one of you might be on time.
We got lost.
Then perhaps a map. I trust you don't need one to find your seats.
What's important about McGonagall, little foreshadowing to future classes if you're education majors, when you get into the College of Education and you take classroom management, McGonagall is in a lot of ways the perfect example of an assertive disciplinarian. She is neither your friend, she is not someone that is warm and cuddly, she is distant, but she is firm and consistent. In a lot of ways, most people look at her as what the perfect teacher should be. And I don't want to spoil it, but later on when you think about Harry Potter, in the last season, in the last of the episodes, she just rocks it. I would say that she's a
Bad word.
but I don't want to swear on film. So what we're going to do is you have to think about her within all of these different scopes about who she was as a teacher as she went through.
Definitely just swore, so I have to bleep something out. It's just more work for me.
I thought you'd like that. As we go through, the last film that I think is really fun to look at is, again, Harry Potter. It's the same first one, The Sorcerer's Stone. What's really good about this particular episode is that this also represents another classroom management situation. Not a good one necessarily, a classroom management situation that shows what happens when we create confrontational relationships in the classroom. It's really easy to create a hierarchy where we as teachers feel like we're the most important people in the room. And so in sometimes doing that, what we do is we create conflict and hostility. My guess is all of you have a Professor Snape in your life. Given more time, we could go through Umbridge and we could go through Trelawney and all of that, but that's a different class.
There will be no foolish wand-waving or silly incantations in this class. As such, I don't expect many of you to appreciate the subtle science and exact art that is potion-making. However, for those select few who possess the predisposition, I can teach you how to bewitch the mind and ensnare the senses. I can tell you how to bottle fame, brew glory, and even put a stopper in death.
All right, we're going to go a little longer in this one because there's two things that I think are really important. This first part, notice how quickly teachers' pets were created within this particular film. All right, I get that this is a little silly that we're watching Harry Potter, but please understand that this is really an essential way of thinking about the purpose of education, because this is talking about privilege. That's what this is about. It's about showing that some people get to have more. They're purer. They're better. They get to go further along. This is a story about the purpose of education that talks about some people get more than others. Continue to watch for me.
Then again, maybe some of you have come to Hogwarts in possession of abilities so formidable that you feel confident enough to not pay attention. Mr. Potter, our new celebrity. Tell me, what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood? You don't know? Well, let's try again. Where, Mr. Potter, would you look if I asked you to find me a bezoar?
I don't know, sir.
And what is the difference between monkshood and wolfbane?
I don't know, sir.
Pity. Clearly, fame isn't everything, is it, Mr. Potter?
Okay. There's a lot to unpackage there. So, one, this is about antagonizing humiliation. That's what's being used as a tool. It's a tool about fear. It's a tool that's tied into getting students to be compliant, not a creating learning environment. What is the purpose of education in this class? To scare the heck out of you. Sorry, another bleep. And so when we're scaring people, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get control and power. It doesn't work within a classroom. And in fact, when we try to do that, we do the exact opposite of what we're intending to do. All right, so here's where it gets really interesting for me, is if you know a lot about the storyline, you're going to find out, and if you haven't watched it, please take this moment to pause, watch all the entire series, then come back and start again.
They don't have a choice. They have to do it.
They have to do
It's part
it.
of their curriculum.
They have to watch the entire Harry Potter series.
Not even read?
No.
That's kind of lame.
Well, they could read it and then watch it and then do a compare and contrast.
Yeah.
Okay. 25 pages the most. So, when you look at this, what I want you to realize is later on in this series, at the end, we realize that Snape is his own personal history, his own crisis, his own baggage as a child and as a young adult is impacting Harry Potter. And sometimes when you look at it, if you go back and watch the videos again after you know that, wow, is that a powerful story? And the reason it's a powerful story is because who we are and what we think, it filters in. It bubbles up through the earth. So this purpose of education isn't just infused with what the politics, the economics, and the social components. It's filtered with our own identity. And it's filtered through our own perceptions, our own baggage. So as a practitioner of education, or as a practitioner in any practice, to not be self-aware is to become a Snape. To go through it, to go to all of the different purposes of education. So there's these three different ideas with it. The first is really the purpose of education, thinking about it from a political standpoint and how that historically came about. And then I want to talk about the social aspects and how our society has kind of created these sort of moralities with it. And then there's the economic, which is a whole lot about whether or not we're reproducing our society again, or whether we're trying to have a status quo system or a system of social mobility where people have that ability to move beyond. So that'll be good. So as we talked about before, some of us look in desks and books. Some of us have to go to schools to think about where school happens, where education occurs. This is my shop. It is crowded. It is sometimes inconvenient. I never have enough room, and I always have more jobs than I need to do. But here's the thing. This is really representative of where I did a lot of my learning. I didn't like school. I found it boring. I thought listening to faculty and teachers pontificate was the dullest thing you could possibly imagine. And yet, oftentimes where I learned is I would come into this space. In fact, one of the things that I learned the most was as I started thinking about how to teach this particular section where I learned, it was much like a place like this that I gained a different perspective on learning. And my father, who lacked a formal college education, came in at one point, and for those of you that have heard this story from my other classes, just pause and move forward and then go on through, or you can listen to it again, it's up to you. One of the things that I did is I took this psychology class, and in my psychology class, I came home and I was very excited because I loved the idea of learning psychology, except as I took this test, my first college exam, I walked in and got ready, prepared for it, took the test, came back, looked at my professor, got my test back, and saw a D-. I was devastated. I was, in a lot of ways, felt like the whole family was depending on me being successful as a college graduate. I was the first person in our family to graduate from college, the first person to even attend. So to be successful was truly important to me. It was something that was really, I put a lot of my pride into it. I put a lot of my personality and character into it. So I brought it back to my dad, and as I came in, he walked into the garage, and we started talking as we often did. He sat down on this tiny little stool, propped up his leg, tapped his pipe on the bottom of his foot, and said, "All right, so what'd you learn in the class?" And my response was, clearly I didn't learn much. I got a D-. I did terribly. And he said, "Well, what did you learn about psychology?" And I sat there for a while longer, and I thought, and I said, "Obviously not anything." And we went a little bit longer, and I told him how devastated I was and how I was embarrassed and how I thought he'd be ashamed of me. And he said, "Well, I'm not ashamed of you. It depends on what you learn about psychology that really matters." And I said, "Well, I got a D." And he said, "Well, what did you learn about psychology?" It took me a while to figure out what he was really asking, and you might think that I'm a little dense, and you might be right. But the question really he was asking me was, what did I learn about the content? And as I started to think about it, I hadn't learned much, but at the time, all I said to him was, "You just don't understand how college works because you didn't go, and you don't know." And so what I did is I left, and my friend and I sat down, and we analyzed this test and figured out how to take it well. We went through all the multiple choice questions, looked at the book, and figured out the questions that are most likely to be asked, the frequency of how often B's and C's are done, because there was no computer ability to randomize it at the time. And so we figured out how to take the test. And I went to school at our next exam, and I sat down, I took the test, I felt good about it, and I got an A. I was very excited. I was pleased with myself. And I walked into my dad's garage, proud as I could be, my hand on the test, and I handed it to him, and I said, "Dad, look what I did." And he said, "Yeah, that's really good. What did you learn about psychology?" For me, learning is a lot more than just what you get in a book, what you do in a moment, what you do on a test. And in fact, I think we put way too much time on the passive learning experience. What I learned, as I stand here and get ready to build a door for my chicken coop, literally building a door for my chicken coop, is, and yes, I have chickens. And yes, that is cool. And so what we have to do is I have to think about all of the things that help us to think about what we're going to do to learn. What sort of things do we need in order to figure out how we learn? This is my space. It's a space where I get to figure out, one, who I am. I can think about physically putting something together. And for me, this is a space where I get to make some mistakes and figure out how to fix them. For example, if I had set this up properly, I would have plugged in my saw before I started. But I didn't, so now you're going to watch me do that. Because it's really difficult to cut something without it plugged in. You're also going to recognize that I also don't follow the rules all the time, which you may or may not have figured out, because what I should do is, if I was teaching you well, is I should actually go out and grab my safety glasses. I couldn't find them because I haven't used them in years. So this is the reality of our life. So what I want you to do as we start to move on to this next path, this is my space. Where you learn, not where do you get educated. Not where do you learn the purpose of education, not where does somebody tell you what you have to take on a test. Where do you learn? And how does that translate to how your students learn? It's really the most significant part. Loud noise. And from there, we can figure out how to build our next process. Thanks.